Hey guys, this is MTG Degree. My name is Luke, and today we're bringing you the Battle for Zendikar Pre-Release Guide. Now there are two things that I wanted to mention before we dive into it. The first one is that we're only going to go over commons and uncommons. And the reason is pretty simple, it's that you're going to see a lot of these as compared to your rares. The second thing that I'd like to go over is the fact that nobody has played with this set before, so I can't say for 100% certain that I haven't missed a single card. So if you think that there is an awesome card that I missed and didn't cover, go ahead and throw it down in the comments. People will see it there and we'll get prepared together. Okay, now the first thing that I'd like to go over are these cycle of retreats, and that's because I think they're kind of a trap. The problem with these retreats is that they all cost mana, they don't do anything on their own, and you have to get these landfall triggers. Most of them, if I wanted to pay that kind of mana for the effect, I'd have to trigger multiple times, and the triggers are all sorcery speed because they rely on landfall, with the exception of fetchable lands and such. And so I think that they're rather weak, and they're probably not what you want to be doing at pre-release. In Constructed, they might be okay, but here I think you should stay away from them. Next, let's go over the lands that I think you can play, and the first one is Spawning Bed. This one's not too exciting, but having a few colorless lands that you can kind of waste some mana on when you have nothing better to do in the late game is probably something worth doing, so having one or two of these doesn't hurt. Along these lines are the Blighted lands. They also give you something to do with your mana in that late game, so I think they're fine. Just make sure that you're not piling up on these colorless lands because we do have to cast our colored spells. Now there are a cycle of lands that come in tapped, and there are two of them that I think are worth playing. The first one is Fertile Thicket, and that's because this thing feels great on turn one. It really helps you get, from 1 mana to 3 or whatever. You can start with just this land, and you have a pretty good chance of getting there. And the second one is Mortuary Mire, and the reason for this is because it is seeming like it might be a bit of a bomb format, so getting your bombs back seems sweet, and you can use this one even if you're not playing black. You can use it kind of just like a spell. And then if you don't have anything to bring back, but you want to hit your land drop, just put it down. It's fine. Now the last land that I want to talk about is Evolving Wilds, and as always, it's pretty playable. Now, it's actually more playable than usual in this set, and the reason why is because of landfall. So with Evolving Wilds, you can get 2 triggers on the same turn because you play it and then you fetch with it, and then when the next card comes down, you get another landfall trigger. So Evolving Wilds is actually really strong here. I'd probably put in just about as many as I could fit as long as I had a good amount of landfall creatures. The other cool thing that Evolving Wilds lets you do is it allows you to get instant speed landfall triggers, which can really mess with your opponents. So I actually like this card way more than usual, even though it's seen a lot of prints in the most recent sets. A quick note on the Expedition lands. Play them just to inspire jealousy. It doesn't even matter if you can do anything with them. Let's move on to artifacts, and the artifact that I wanted to mention was Hedron Archive. And the reason for this is because in your rampy style decks, you can use it to ramp up to those Eldrazi, and when you're done, spitting out an Eldrazi or 2, you can cash it in for some cards, which is always nice. Okay, so next let's talk about white. And white is a very interesting color because it has no Eldrazi at all. Now, this means that it's going to be a bit weaker of a pair if you're trying to get to Eldrazi in the late game. So if you want to be quick, if you want those ally synergies, then white is definitely where you want to go, but it won't help you with that oops, I Eldrazi'd type feel that the rest of the colors have. So keep that in mind when you're pairing anything with white. Okay, so white is as aggressive as always, and the creatures that I'd like to highlight are Coreblade Whirl, Serene Steward, and Felidar Cub. So these are all 2/2s with some sort of upside. And so they're the first ones that I want to mention. They kind of fit that aggressive feel that white has. The next card that I like to talk about is Core Castigator, which interestingly is a 3/1 that specifically can't be blocked by Scions. When I saw this, I went through the rest of the set looking for 1 toughness creatures, and it seems like that is just a lower quantity than usual. The last card is Shadow Glider, which is a simple 2/2 for 3 that flies, and that's a fair aggressive price for a 2/2 flyer. Now before we move on from white creatures, I'd like to point out that there are several white creatures with the Rally tagline. Now if you have a lot of allies, these go from being mediocre on their own to very good together. So count up your allies, and if you have a lot of them, put in some of those Rally creatures to get as much value as possible. Alright, so next let's talk about non-creature spells. The first two are going to be Smite the Monstrous and Stasis Snare. This is because if you're playing white, you are going to come across big creatures that you can't stop. Somebody's going to cast a 10/10 Eldrazi on you, and you've got to have an answer, so these will be the answers to your problems. The next card is Lithomancer's Focus, which gives a creature +2/+2 until end of turn, which is a pretty good buff for a single white mana. And it just happens to blow out all of the devoid and colorless creatures in the set. So I rate this actually quite highly. If you have one or two of them in your pool and you're playing white, go ahead and throw them in. The last card that I'd like to mention is Angelic Gift, and not just because I like angels so much. You get to attach it to a creature for 1 and a white. It gains flying, so your little creatures that are starting to get blocked can continue to get in damage, and you draw a card to keep those engines running. That sums it up for white, and what you should be getting out of this is you should be trying to kill your enemies pretty quickly. You're going to try to get them before those Eldrazi start taking over the board. Sometimes, however, it's hard to put together this quick aggression playstyle in Sealed, just because your packs are spitting out random cards at you. So if you don't have a quite aggressive creature base, perhaps white is not what you want. Alright, let's talk about blue, starting with the creatures. The first one is Ruination Guide. A 3/2 for 3, this is fairly costed. It has Ingest, just in case you have those synergies, and it gives colorless creatures +1/+0. Now this is really important because remember, Scions. So your Scions all become 2/1s, which is very strong. Of course, all your other Eldrazi are also going to get this boost. So this is a pretty sweet card. Our next creature is Eldrazi Sky Spawner, which by the way is a really ridiculous flying creature. It's a 2/1 for 3, which is pretty fair for in the air, 2 power. And you get a Scion on the ground, a 2/1. That is just straight value. You basically get 3 power for 3, and 2 of it is in the air. Remember how excited people were about Gear per Gearcrafter? This thing's better. Our next card is Incubator Drone, which is a 2/3 for 4, and you get a 1/1 Scion. It'll help you ramp if you got those Eldrazi waiting for you at the other end. Our next creature is Cloud Manta, and it continues the theme of blue creatures that dodge things. I mean, that's kind of what blue does. So it's a 3/2 flyer for 4, and it's fair. It does damage. Our next card is Wind Rider Patrol, which is actually outrageous. So it's a 4/3 in the air for 5, and whenever it deals combat damage, it's in the air, so it'll be dealing some. You scry 2. So this thing finishes off your opponent on a pretty quick speed, and even if you don't have all the answers, you will soon because you are digging deep. This card's great. Our next card is Drowner of Hope, and it is a good one. It's a 5/5 for 6, and you get 2 1/1 Scions. It has the ability, you can sacrifice Scions in order to tap down creatures. So as soon as it comes down, you can immediately clear the way if your opponent thinks that they've attacked with just barely enough defense left behind. This card's really great at catching people off guard, and it has sizable body, and it can ramp you. It's really versatile. I like it. Now let's talk about our non-creature spells. First of all, we've got a card draw spell, Coastal Discovery. This is a draw 2 for 4, which is pretty fair, and if you want to draw cards, blue is where it's at. And it's also got Awaken, so if you've got that late game coming in, then Awaken can allow you to spend that extra mana that you don't have anything to spend on. The next non-creature spell is Tightening Coils, which for 2 mana gives a creature -6/-0. Only the biggest Eldrazi are really going to have any power left after this, so it's essentially a removal spell. I like it a lot, because I like removal spells. Now I know some of you are probably playing blue because you're blue mages and you like to do that. And one thing that blue mages love to do is counterspell things. And if you are going to do that, then I would say Spell Shrivel is where it's at. It's not that conditional. It'll counter small spells early on, it'll counter big spells later on. So this one's pretty good. I like it a lot better than something like Horribly Awry, which, you know, is a little conditional and might not get what you want to get. Now, before we move away from blue things, I just want to point out that I just released a video giving away an Altered Art Jace from Magic Origins, so go check that out if you like free value. Our journey through the color pie continues, and the next color is black. The first creature I'd like to talk about is Culling Drone, which is just a 2/2 for 2 with Ingest, so it's just fair. The next one is Carrier Thrall, which I actually like a bit better. It's a 2/1 for 2, so it's still got that 2 power, and when it dies, it leaves behind a Scion, which is awesome. You're just getting that sweet value. The next creature is Malakir Familiar, which is a 2/1 for 3 with Flying, which is actually already fair, but it also has Death Touch, which is sweet. So early on in the game, you can get in for lots of damage. If the sky gets a bit clouded and you don't want to give it away, you know, there's a good chance that you can chump block some huge Eldrazi with this thing, and it's just a great value early and late because of that Death Touch. Also in that 3 converted mana cost slot, we have Dominator Drone and Wasteland Strangler, both of which are 3/2s for 3 and have a pretty good come into battlefield ability. If you can use these guys, so have colorless creatures, have some ingest creatures, definitely go for it. They have awesome upside. Even if you can't get that upside up, they're just fair creatures. They've got a power equal to the converted mana cost. Let's move on to non-creature spells, and the first one that I want to mention is Bone Splinters. Normally Bone Splinters kind of hurts you because you have to get rid of those creatures in order to use it. However, in the world of Scions, Bone Splinters is great, right? So you have these little 1/1s sitting around, they're not accomplishing much. Suddenly, you get to kill a giant creature by giving away your 1/1. I mean, it doesn't hurt that badly. The next spells are Ruinous Path and Demon's Grasp. Both of these are going to kill stuff for you, which is what black is good at, and killing stuff is really good and limited. Creatures are where it's at, so killing them is also where it's at. Okay, so one card that I wanted to touch on before we leave black is Rising Miasma. And the reason why is because I think that it's probably bad in most strategies. And here's the reason why. Let's say you're trying to ramp, you're taking the ramp route. Then Rising Miasma might help keep you alive, but it also kills all the Scions that you're trying to use to ramp. So it's kind of counter to the real strategy. Let's look at the other case where you're being very aggressive. Obviously, this is just going to kill a lot of your stuff, and it might kill the opponent's Scions if they're trying to ramp as well, but there's just too much collateral damage. So this card kind of doesn't fit that well into either strategy, and for that reason, I think you should probably not play it unless you've got a really good plan. Next up is red, and as you can imagine, it has some aggressive creatures. So let's go over our 2-drops first. The first 2 are Akum Stonewalker and Makindi Slide Runner, which both have 2 power and some good upside, especially the Stonewaker, which can allow you to waste mana later in the game to harass them with these elementals. In the 3-drop slot, we have Fire Mantle Mage, Valakut Predator, and Nettle Drone. The Nettle Drone is particularly interesting because a lot of these earlier creatures can become useless later on, whereas this one can always threaten to block, and then at the end of turn, ping them. Very annoying card. In the 4-drop slot, we have Belligerent Whiptail, which is a 4/2. However, on a landfall trigger, it gets First Strike, and a 4-power First Striker is very annoying by anyone's standards, so I like this card a lot. In non-creature red spells, we have Sure Strike, which gives your creature +3/+0 and First Strike until end of turn, which allows a fairly small creature to eat a fairly large creature. I like this one a lot. The next 2 cards are Touch of the Void and Rolling Thunder, both of which are great removal, especially Rolling Thunder, which if you have some rampy deck, can do an extremely ridiculous amount of damage spread out exactly as you want it. I really like Rolling Thunder. Last but certainly not least of our colors is green, and Wizards is reminding us. Do you remember that green is that ramping color where you ramp? Because pretty much everything is ramping. It is rampant with it. So if you want to cast those big Eldrazi, those impressively large creatures, green is going to be your staple. So let's go over the creatures first. First we have Blister Pod, which is very unexciting. It's a 1/1 for 1. When it dies, you get a 1/1 Scion. So basically this is in those I am committed to ramp decks, where you're going to use this to stop yourself from taking too much damage, and then use the Scion later on in order to cast your big Eldrazi. Next, let's talk 2-drops. So our first one is Oran Reef Invoker, which is a 2/2 for 2, and can grow for a ridiculous cost. So basically it's a 2/2 for 2. The next one is Snapping Gnarlid, which is a 2/2 for 2 as well. However, it gets bigger with landfall. So this one is actually pretty nice and aggressive. Hits pretty hard. Our last 2-mana spell is Beastcaller Savant, which is a 1/1 mana card. So this is just more green ramp. And on that note, we have Lifespring Druid, which is a 2/1 ramper for 3. Our last 3 creature spells I'd like to mention are Call of the Scions, Eyeless Watcher, and Brood Monitor. All of these are spitting out a ridiculous number of Scions, and it's pretty much doing what you're wanting to do. I think green is very clearly marked as, I'm going to cast big creatures, and they're probably going to be colorless. Now, in order to help you ramp to these huge creatures, Wizards has printed a couple of ramp spells that I like. And the first one is Seek the Wilds. Swell of Growth is the second, and Natural Connection. So these are all pretty great. The one thing that I'd mention though is if you can use creatures instead, if you can use Scions, then use the Scions, because these are getting you lands and whatnot, but the Scions allow you to block if absolutely necessary, whereas these spells will only get you land. Now the next rampy spell I like is From Beyond, which is really sweet because it basically says I will get to that Eldrazi because I'm getting all these Scions, and if I don't have it when I'm ready, I will have it because From Beyond will get me the exact card that I need. This card is pretty sweet, and I would play it if you're trying to ramp into pretty much anything. Of course, we like removal, and we do have it in Unnatural Aggression. However, unlike in most sets recently, it doesn't pump before the fight, so your creature has to be strictly larger. This probably won't be a problem if you're casting these ginormous creatures, but just keep it in mind. Next, let's talk about those big colorless creatures that you want to cast. There are a lot of them, and frankly, with the right ramp deck, you can pretty much pick most of them as your finisher. Just pick something big. However, I would like to highlight a few. The first one is Bane of Bala Ged. The great thing about this card is that it forces your opponent to lose a lot. So when it attacks, they immediately lose 2 cards. And then when they block, they have to have something pretty big to block with just 1. So they're probably going to block with 2, which means that you're getting either 3 or 4 cards for your 1 card, which is quite the value. Our next card is one that can be quite large. It is Ulamog's Despoiler. The only thing that I would mention before you put this in your deck is make sure that you have enough ingest creatures lower in your curve, because this guy is really uninspiring if you don't get that trigger. Lastly, we have Breaker of Armies, which I would just say is really well named. I like this guy. And considering how hugely tall he is, it seems weird that he doesn't have reach. That seems to be a weird problem with a lot of Eldrazi. They're enormous, but don't have reach. Now, for non-finisher colorless spells, I'd like to talk about 2. One is Titan's Presence. If you've got big creatures, this thing will kill small creatures, or even not so small creatures. This thing is pretty great. The other one is Kozilek's Channeler, which just has a really fair sized body. You're not ashamed to play it, and it ramps you. I mean, the thing is pretty sweet. So if you've got a ramp strategy at all, throw in Kozilek's Channeler. Alright, so next let's talk about gold cards. And first let's talk about the devoid gold cards. So these are all playable in their colors. I think they're all fine. But none of them are so strong that they make me want to play those colors. If it happen to be in the colors that you select, then yeah, go for it, throw them in. They're definitely on the right power level, but they're not absurd. Now, the strongest one in my opinion is Catacomb Sifter, because you get totally good value for the power and toughness that it generates with itself and its Scion. It generates the Scion if you happen to be ramping, and it has an ability for when creatures die. And you have a Scion, which you can kill at any time, so this thing just has pretty great value. I really like Catacomb Sifter. Next, let's talk about the non-devoid gold cards. So I like all of them. I think, once again, that they're all playable. They're all just fine. I think the two strongest ones are Skyrider Elf and Drana's Emissary. Especially the Emissary, which is ridiculous. It's a 2/2 for 3, and every turn it drains them for 1. This thing is super annoying, and I would play it in those colors 100% of the time. Now, before we move on from the gold cards, I like to point out Royal Spout, which is a pretty sweet card. It's got Awaken if you have mana to waste, and even if you don't, the thing is pretty sweet. So it gets rid of a threat for a turn, and it's not card disadvantage because I have to redraw that threat. And the other cool thing about it is that it is in a land of Scions. So if your opponent sacrifices a bunch of Scions in order to get some big creature, and you put it back on top of their library, well, when they redraw it the next turn, they won't have the Scions, and so you've actually dealt with the problem. So the card is actually a bit sweeter than it looks, and I'd play it if I were in those colors. Well, friends, that just about wraps it up for the Battle for Zendikar pre-release guide. If you thought it was good, if it helped you out, go ahead and hit those like and subscribe buttons. You know it helps me out. I'm a YouTuber. I wish you best of luck at your pre-releases, and I'll see you guys next video.